There are some key elements in Facsimile 1 that are completely different than anything else drawn in ancient Egypt. And that tells us something in and of itself. But its closest parallels, when we translate the texts that tell us something about these parallels, a number of them actually have to do with human sacrifice. Some of them are about protecting someone from human sacrifice. Some of them are about sacrificing someone because they've done something they shouldn't have done. Both of these match awfully well with Facsimile 1. And so in the end, while our critics want to look at Egyptian parallels and say what Joseph said was wrong, I'm not sure if we should be looking at parallels, but when we do, they need to deal with the fact that the closest parallels actually match very, very well with what Joseph Smith is talking about.
Ancient sources verify that Abraham was almost sacrificed, that he was saved by God, that he intervened, that he prayed for salvation, and all these things, very, very unlikely that Joseph Smith could have known about him. To get so many of them right just seems impossible based on odds alone.
Another thing that really is fascinating to me is this idea that an Egyptian priest would have a text about Abraham. The ancient owner of Facsimile 1, a guy named Horus is the Greek version of his name. He's a priest in Thebes, an Egyptian priest in Thebes about 200 BC. Interestingly enough, we know that he is associated with a ritual that sometimes did involve human sacrifice. So there's another tie between what we know of the papyri and what the Book of Abraham is telling us. But more than that, this priest comes from the time period that we find out they did know something about Abraham.
3 different places on Facsimile number 1, it mentions Heliopolis. Heliopolis is Greek for sun city. It was the place where the sun god Re was worshipped. It was a place of special holiness to the Egyptians. And again, I mentioned before that Josephus says that Abraham taught the priests of Heliopolis astronomy. The association of Israelites and Abraham with Heliopolis runs rather deep. So you've got priests, Jewish priests in a temple worshiping Jehovah, offering sacrifices to him in Heliopolis. The point is that there seems to have been a very close connection between Israelites and Abraham and Heliopolis as such.
The things that Abraham is doing and preaching against their gods, and according to some of the other ancient sources, not the Book of Abraham or the Bible, but other ancient sources seem to agree that he does so. He sometimes mocks these gods and even can be destructive to the idols. That's the kind of thing that would have targeted him for this kind of a sacrifice that we find in the text of the Book of Abraham.
For example, the idea that Abraham was, there was an attempt on Abraham's life because he was preaching the gospel, preaching against paganism, idolatry. The Bible says absolutely nothing about that, but there are, again, several different ancient documents that support it, and by several, I mean on the order of hundreds.
And so it's interesting that the text of the Book of Abraham presents us a picture that even 10 years ago, Egyptologists would have thought that doesn't fit with what we know of ancient Egypt. But now we see it's a perfect fit. It weds together absolutely perfectly with what we find in Egyptian history. And the key was that no one had ever sat and looked at it carefully. If we do the Egyptology correctly, it supports what we find in the Book of Abraham.
In the facsimile itself, Joseph Smith gives an explanation of the figures which it contains. Previously, some critics have argued whether he was accurate in his interpretations. But as we learn more about ancient Egypt, there is more we see that Joseph Smith was correct. In Figure 1 of Facsimile 1, it is explained that the bird is an angel of the Lord. This was a common theme among Egyptian writings to portray heavenly messengers as birds. Figures 2 to 4 will be dealt with elsewhere in this video. Joseph Smith explains that figures 5 through 8 in Facsimile 1, which are the 4 canopic jars under the lion's couch, are to be interpreted as the idolatrous god Cana, Libna, Makmachra, and Karesh. Interestingly enough, he was correct in his interpretation, and these were actual gods worshipped in the ancient Near East, despite the fact that the Bible makes no mention of them.
I go through the various linguistic structures that might be present in Elkanah, and then I describe 6 concrete proposals for that word. And the one that I like the best comes from Akkadian, Il Kanachi, which means El of Canaan. And so that Akkadian name was later represented in Greek in a simplified form as El Cana, Chi, Nu, Alpha in Greek letters. And so this is a name that fits very closely with what's described in the book of Abraham. And the Canaanites had a cult of child and human sacrifice throughout their history. And that's one of the principal features of the book of Abraham, is this child and human sacrifice. And so it fits very well with seeing Elkanah as El, the principal god of the Canaanite pantheon.
In Figure 9, Joseph tells us that the crocodile character is the idolatrous god of Pharaoh. Again, Joseph Smith was correct. Sobek was an Egyptian god and was depicted as a crocodile in ancient Egypt. One Egyptian king, whom Sobek was his god, took upon himself the name of Nefru Sobek. Beautiful is Sobek. Unis or Wenis was a king in the 5th dynasty. Utterance 317 of the pyramid text says, "The king appears as the crocodile god Sobek." Not only was this an ancient Egyptian god, but it was also the god of the Pharaoh, which is exactly how Joseph Smith described it. Figure 10 is described as Abraham in Egypt. The lotus flower is a representation of a foreigner in Egypt, which is precisely what Abraham was. Figure 11 is explained to represent the pillars of heaven, as understood by the Egyptians. This phrase appears several times in ancient Egyptian literature. Kevin Barney writes, "The Hebrew firmament was believed to be a solid dome supported by pillars. This in turn was closely associated with the celestial ocean which it supported." Figure 12 is Rao Ki Yang, signifying expanse or the firmament over our heads, but in this case, in relation to this subject, the Egyptians meant it to signify Shaumau, to be high, or the heavens, answering to the Hebrew word Shalmaihim. Rao Ki Yang is very similar to the Hebrew word for expanse, and Shalmaihim is correctly translated as heaven.